Some moments change everything we think we know about our world. For Nurse Lila Mathers, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday when she thought she was treating a simple bug bite. After 30 years at Millfield's clinic, she had seen broken bones, delivered babies, and comforted countless families. At 62, she was counting down to retirement in just 6 months. Then Harold Brennan walked in, clutching his bandaged arm and wincing in pain. The tough old farmer never complained about anything, so Lila knew something was seriously wrong. When she peeled back the blood-stained gauze, what she found living under his skin wasn't any bug bite she had ever seen. It was something that would turn her quiet farming community upside down and force her to face secrets that had been buried for decades. But what exactly was moving beneath Harold's skin that morning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist still clung to the fields surrounding Millfield when Lila Mathers unlocked the clinic door at 7:30, same as she had every weekday for the past 30 years. The brass nameplate beside the entrance read Millfield Community Health Clinic, though most folks simply called it Doc Chun's place or where Nurse Lila works. The building itself was nothing fancy, a converted Victorian house, painted cheerful yellow with white trim, surrounded by maple trees that had grown tall enough to shade the parking lot where pickup trucks outnumbered sedans 3-1. Inside, sunlight filtered through lace curtains that Lila had sewn herself back in 1995, casting warm patterns across the hardwood floors she mopped every evening before heading home. The waiting room held a dozen mismatched chairs salvaged from the old church, a coffee table stacked with well-worn magazines, and a children's corner with toys donated by grateful families. On the wall hung Lila's nursing certificate from the State University, the paper slightly yellowed but the seal still crisp, a reminder of the young woman who'd arrived in Millfield fresh out of school, determined to make a difference. That young woman had aged into someone the whole town trusted with their deepest fears and most private pain. At 62, Lila moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen birth and death, healing and heartbreak, triumph and tragedy. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, her scrubs pressed and spotless, her hands steady and gentle whether she was drawing blood from a frightened child or holding the hand of someone saying goodbye to a loved one. "Morning, Lila," called Dr. Margaret Chen as she breezed through the back door, coffee in one hand and medical bag in the other. At 45, Margaret was everything Lila remembered being at that age, energetic, convinced she could cure the world if she just worked hard enough. Margaret had joined the practice 8 years ago when old Dr. Hayes retired, bringing with her modern ideas about preventive care and patient education that complemented Lila's decades of practical experience. "Coffee's fresh," Lila replied, checking the appointment book one last time. Tuesday mornings were always busy, the weekend warriors nursing pulled muscles from too much yard work, mothers bringing in children with suspicious rashes, elderly patients coming for their regular checkups. Mrs. Patterson's coming in at 8 for her blood pressure check. Says it's been running high again. Margaret nodded, already reviewing patient files, and Jim Kowalski's scheduled for 10, still complaining about that shoulder. Ever since he fell off that ladder fixing his store sign last month, Lila shook her head with the fond exasperation of someone who'd bandaged the same stubborn man's injuries more times than she could count. Jim owned Kowalski Hardware, the kind of place where you could buy everything from penny nails to riding lawn mowers, and where half the town gathered each morning to drink coffee and solve the world's problems. He was also the kind of man who'd rather ignore pain than admit he needed help. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm. Mrs. Patterson arrived precisely at 8, as she had every Tuesday for the past 5 years, carrying a handwritten log of her daily blood pressure readings. At 68, she took her health seriously, walking 3 miles every morning and following her medication schedule with military precision. Lila had watched her transform from a worried widow, afraid of every symptom, into a confident woman who understood her body and trusted her own judgment. "Numbers look good today," Lila said, wrapping the blood pressure cuff after taking the reading. "That new medication Dr. Chen prescribed seems to be working well. I feel more like myself again," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "Sleeping better, not so anxious all the time, makes me realize how poorly I was feeling before." Young Tommy Rodriguez came in with his mother at 8:30, sporting a spectacular black eye from a baseball that had taken an unfortunate bounce during yesterday's Little League practice, while Margaret examined the bruising. Lila distracted the 8-year-old with stories about her own son's childhood mishaps, making him giggle despite his obvious discomfort. Ice for 20 minutes, then 20 minutes off, Lila instructed Tommy's mother, Maria. If the swelling doesn't start going down by tomorrow, or if he develops any vision problems, call us right away. Maria Rodriguez worked 2 jobs to support Tommy and his younger sister, cleaning houses during the day, stocking shelves at the grocery store 3 nights a week. She spoke English with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it as an adult, always worried she might miss some crucial detail about her children's health. Lila made sure to write down the instructions clearly, knowing Maria would follow them to the letter. At 9:15, Sarah Beth Morrison hurried in, clutching a bandaged finger, her usual calm demeanor replaced by obvious frustration. As the town librarian, Sarah Beth was accustomed to handling books, not kitchen knives, but she'd been helping her elderly neighbor prepare vegetables for canning when the accident happened. "Foolish of me," she said, unwrapping the makeshift bandage to reveal a clean but deep cut across her index finger. "I should have been more careful." "Accidents happen to all of us," Lila said kindly, cleaning the wound with practiced efficiency. "The important thing is you cleaned it well and got it bandaged quickly. This will heal just fine with a few stitches." Sarah Beth had been Millfield's librarian for over 20 years, transforming the dusty old building into a community center where children attended story hours. Teenagers found quiet places to study, and adults discovered new worlds between worn covers. She lived alone in a neat apartment above the library, content with her books and her garden. Though Lila sometimes worried she was too content, too willing to live her life through the stories of others rather than writing her own. Jim Kowalski arrived for his 10 o'clock appointment walking like a man trying to pretend his shoulder wasn't bothering him. At 58 he still lifted heavy boxers and climbed ladders like he was 30. Ignoring his body's increasingly frequent reminders that he wasn't. His hardware store had been in his family for 3 generations, and he took pride in being able to fix anything that broke in Millfield. Shoulders feeling much better, he insisted, though Lila could see him wince when Margaret asked him to raise his arm above his head. "Jim Kowalski," Lila said with mock sternness, "you've been telling me things are much better for 30 years, even when you had pneumonia and could barely stand up." He had the grace to look sheepish. "Well, maybe it's still a little sore." The morning continued with its familiar parade of scraped knees, worried parents, and neighbors checking on neighbors. This was the part of her job Lila would miss most. When she retired, the daily connections, the way she'd become woven into the fabric of people's lives. She'd delivered Maria Rodriguez's children, had bandaged Tommy's father's cuts when he was Tommy's age, had held Mrs. Patterson's hand when her husband died suddenly of a heart attack 7 years ago. Around 11:30, as Lila was updating patient files, she found herself thinking about retirement again. 6 months felt both too long and not nearly long enough. Too long because her arthritis was getting worse and the long days were becoming harder on her body. Not long enough because she couldn't quite imagine what she'd do with herself when she wasn't needed here anymore. Margaret had been encouraging her to travel, to visit the daughter who lived in Seattle and the grandchildren she saw only twice a year. "You've spent 30 years taking care of everyone else," Margaret often said. "It's time to take care of yourself." But Millfield was where Lila belonged. Her husband Robert was buried in the cemetery behind the Methodist church. Their house, the same one they'd bought as newlyweds, held 40 years of memories. The garden she'd been tending since 1985 was just reaching its prime, with fruit trees finally mature enough to provide shade and flowers that had been reseeding themselves for decades. More than that, though, Millfield was where she was known. Not just as a nurse, but as Robert Mathers' widow. As the woman who'd organized the food drive every Christmas for 25 years. As someone who remembered when Tommy Rodriguez's grandmother had first arrived in town speaking no English. As the person who'd sat with Jim Kowalski's mother during her final illness when his father was too proud to ask for help. These were her people, and she was theirs. The thought was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots on the front steps. Through the window, Lila could see Harold Brennan climbing slowly toward the door, his left arm cradled against his chest. Harold was 70 years old, had been farming the same land for nearly 50 years. And in all that time, Lila could count on one hand the number of times he'd come to the clinic. Harold Brennan was the kind of man who set his own broken bones and stitched his own cuts, who considered pain a natural part of life and medical attention a luxury for people with too much time on their hands. If Harold Brennan was here, something was seriously wrong. "Harold," Lila called as he pushed through the door, What brings you in today?" His weathered face was pale beneath his permanent farmer's tan, and she could see dried blood staining the cuff of his flannel shirt. "Morning, Lila. Sorry to bother you, but I've got this bite on my arm that's been giving me trouble." A bite. Harold Brennan, who'd been stung by more bees, bitten by more spiders, and scratched by more thorns than anyone else in 3 counties, was seeking medical attention for a bite. Lila felt a chill of foreboding that had nothing to do with the morning air conditioning. "Let's get you into exam room 2 and take a look," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden quickening of her pulse. As Harold followed her down the familiar hallway, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. After 30 years of nursing, she'd learned to trust her instincts. And right now, every instinct was telling her that whatever was hiding beneath Harold Brennan's blood-stained bandage was going to change everything. Harold settled heavily into the examination chair, his usual stoic expression betraying flickers of genuine discomfort. In the bright fluorescent light of exam room 2, Lila could see that the blood stain on his shirt sleeve was larger than she'd first noticed, and there was something about the way he held his arm, not just protective, but almost fearful. "When did this happen?" she asked, washing her hands thoroughly before pulling on latex gloves. "Started bothering me about a week ago," Harold said, his voice rougher than usual. "Thought it was just a spider bite at first. You know how it is. This time of year, plenty of critters out in the barn." Lila nodded, though something in his tone made her pause. Harold had been dealing with barn spiders, wasps, and the occasional snake for 5 decades. He wouldn't seek medical attention for something routine, but it's gotten worse. "Yeah." The single word carried more weight than Harold usually packed into entire conversations. "Much worse." She began carefully cutting away the makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around his forearm, layer after layer of gauze that had been changed multiple times, judging by the varying degrees of bloodstain and discoloration. As she worked, she noticed Harold's breathing becoming more shallow, his good hand gripping the edge of the examination table. "Harold, are you feeling all right? You look a little pale." He swallowed hard. "Just get it over with, Lila, please." The last layer of gauze came away with a wet, sucking sound that made both of them wince. What lay beneath defied everything Lila had learned in 30 years of nursing. The wound was roughly circular, about the size of a silver dollar, with inflamed edges that pulsed with an angry red color she'd never seen before. But it wasn't the appearance that made her stomach lurch. It was the movement. Something was definitely alive under Harold's skin. She could see it shifting, a pale, segmented something that seemed to writhe just beneath the surface of the wound. As she watched, frozen in shock, a small portion of it became visible, smooth, wet, and undeniably organic. "Dear God," she whispered. Harold's eyes were squeezed shut, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping in his cheek. "Can you get it out?" Lila forced herself to lean closer, her training overriding her revulsion. Whatever this was, it was her job to help Harold, and she'd seen plenty of disturbing things in her career. Maggots in neglected wounds, foreign objects that had no business being where they were, infections that had gotten completely out of hand. But this was different. This was something that was clearly alive, clearly moving with purpose, and clearly unlike anything in her medical experience. "I need to get Dr. Chen," she said, reaching for the intercom button. "No." Harold's voice was sharp, urgent. "Just you, Lila, please. Just you." She paused, her finger hovering over the button. "Harold, I need a doctor to look at this. This is beyond. I trust you," he said, opening his eyes for the first time since she'd unwrapped the bandage. "I've known you for 30 years. I don't know her." The fear in his voice was unmistakable now, and it wasn't just fear of pain or medical procedures. This was the fear of someone who knew more than he was saying. Lila made a decision that would haunt her. Later she nodded and reached for the sterile tweezers. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "I know." Working as gently as possible, she managed to grasp what appeared to be the creature's head or front end. It was slippery, resistant, and when she began to pull, it seemed to fight back, burrowing deeper into the surrounding tissue. Harold's knuckles went white on the table edge, but he didn't make a sound. "Almost got it," she murmured, adjusting her grip. With one smooth motion, she extracted what looked like a pale, segmented worm, about 3 inches long and roughly the thickness of a pencil. It writhed frantically in the tweezers, clearly very much alive. Harold opened his eyes and stared at the creature with an expression that wasn't surprised, it was recognition. "You've seen this before," Lila said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Martha had them." Martha, Harold's wife, who had died 3 years ago after a brief, mysterious illness that had baffled everyone, including Dr. Hayes, who was running the clinic at the time. Lila remembered the funeral, how sudden it had been, how Harold had seemed more angry than grief-stricken, how he'd avoided talking about Martha's final weeks. "Harold, what do you mean Martha had them?" "Same thing. Started with what looked like bug bites, then they got worse. Much worse." His voice was hollow now, the voice of a man carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear. "She had dozens of them before it was over." Lila carefully placed the creature in a sterile specimen container, watching it continue to move, despite being removed from its host. "Did Dr. Hayes know about this?" Harold's laugh was bitter. "Oh, he knew. They all knew. The town council, the mayor Hayes, half the people in this town knew what killed my Martha, and they all agreed it was better to call it heart failure and move on." The specimen container felt heavy in Lila's hands, weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand. "Harold, if there was some kind of outbreak—" "It wasn't an outbreak," he interrupted. "It was worse than that. It was something we caused. Something we let happen because we were too proud or too scared to deal with it properly." Before Lila could ask what he meant, Dr. Chun's voice came over the intercom. "Lila, is everything all right in there?" "I thought I heard." Harold's hand shot out and grabbed Lila's wrist with surprising strength. "Please," he whispered urgently, "don't tell her. Not yet. Give me time to figure out how to handle this. Harold, I can't keep medical information from Dr. Chen. She's the physician here. And if there's a public health risk, there is," he said. "But not the kind you think. And if this gets out wrong, if it gets to the state health department before we can control the story, it'll destroy this town. It'll destroy people who've been carrying this burden for years, trying to protect everyone else." Lila stared at him, the specimen container still clutched in her other hand. The creature inside continued its restless movement, and she found herself thinking about Martha Brennan's sweet, quiet Martha, who had tended the most beautiful flower garden in Millfield, and who had died far too young of what everyone was told was sudden heart failure. "Lila," Dr. Chen's voice came again. "Do you need assistance?" Harold's eyes pleaded with her. This man, who had never asked anyone for anything in his entire life, was begging her to keep his secret, at least for now. "We're fine," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just finishing up some wound care." Harold released her wrist, relief flooding his weathered features. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Lila said, cleaning and bandaging the wound with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "I want answers, Harold. All of them, and I want them soon." He nodded, pulling his shirt sleeve down over the fresh bandage. "Meet me at my place tonight, after dark. I'll tell you everything I know." "Why after dark?" Harold stood slowly, looking older than his 70 years. "Because some secrets are easier to share in the darkness. And because there are people in this town who've spent the last 3 years making sure nobody ever asks the questions you're asking now." As Harold left the clinic, walking carefully to his battered pickup truck, Lila remained in the examination room staring at the specimen container. The creature inside had finally stopped moving, but she could swear it was still alive, just resting. She had 30 years of medical training, 3 decades of experience with everything from routine checkups to life-threatening emergencies. But nothing in her background had prepared her for this moment, when she realized that the quiet farming community she'd devoted her life to serving had been keeping secrets that might be darker than anything she'd ever imagined. The intercom crackled again. "Lila, could you step into my office for a moment?" Dr. Chen's tone was carefully neutral, but Lila caught the underlying concern. She'd known Margaret long enough to recognize when the younger woman was trying not to alarm her. Lila looked one more time at the specimen container, then carefully placed it in the small refrigerator they used for storing certain medications. Whatever this creature was, whatever secrets Harold was carrying, she had a feeling that her quiet Tuesday morning had just become the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple medical mystery. The comfortable routine of her final months before retirement had just been shattered, and she wasn't sure if what emerged from the wreckage would be something she could live with, or something that would destroy everything she'd spent 30 years trying to protect. Dr. Chen's office felt smaller than usual as Lila closed the door behind her. Margaret sat behind her desk, hands folded, wearing the expression she reserved for difficult conversations, the same look she'd worn when telling the Martinez family that their father's chest pain was indeed a heart attack, or when explaining to elderly Mrs. Foster that her persistent cough was actually lung cancer. That was quite a long appointment with Harold, Margaret said carefully. Is everything all right? Lila had been dreading this moment since Harold walked out the door. She'd never lied to a colleague in her 30-year career, had never hidden medical information that might be important for patient care or public health, but she'd also never been asked to keep a secret that might protect people she'd known and cared for her entire adult life. He had an infected wound that needed cleaning and dressing, she said, which was technically true. Nothing that required a physician's attention. Margaret nodded, but her expression remained concerned. It's just that Harold Brennan has never come to this clinic for anything less than a broken bone or a heart attack. And you looked rather shaken when I called on the intercom. Some wounds are worse than they appear from the outside, Lila replied, again staying within the bounds of truth while avoiding the larger implications. They sat in silence for a moment, and Lila could see Margaret weighing whether to push further. Finally, the younger woman sighed. You know you can talk to me about anything, right? If there's something unusual, something that concerns you. I know, Lila said softly. And I appreciate that more than you realize. After leaving Dr. Chun's office, Lila found it nearly impossible to concentrate on her remaining patients. She went through the motions, taking vital signs, updating charts, assisting with examinations, but her mind kept returning to the specimen container in the refrigerator, and Harold's haunted expression when he'd mentioned Martha's name. During her lunch break, she drove to the Millfield Public Library, a brick building that had been the town's pride since 1892. Sarah Beth Morrison looked up from the circulation desk as Lila entered, her bandaged finger prominently displayed, but clearly not slowing her down. Lila, how nice to see you again so soon. How's the finger feeling? Much better, thank you. Those stitches you put in were perfect. Sarah Beth gestured toward the research section. What brings you by? Looking for something to read during retirement. Actually, I was hoping to look through some old newspaper archives, specifically around 1998. When Martha Brennan died. Sarah Beth's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around the eyes, a momentary pause before responding. Of course. The microfilm reader is in the back corner. Would you like me to help you find the specific dates? That would be helpful. As they walked toward the research area, Sarah Beth asked, May I ask what you're looking for? 1998 is quite a while back. Lila had prepared for this question. I'm putting together a memorial scrapbook for Harold. He mentioned recently that he'd never properly honored Martha's memory, and I thought it might be nice to collect some of the articles from when she passed. It was a plausible story, the kind of thoughtful gesture people in Millfield had come to expect from Lila Mathers, but Sarah Beth's response surprised her. I'm not sure there were many articles, she said quietly. Martha's death was it was very private. The family requested minimal coverage. Still, there must have been an obituary. Maybe something about the funeral service. Sarah Beth busied herself with loading the microfilm cartridge, not meeting Lila's eyes. I'll get you set up with the dates around her death. You can see what's available. The obituary, when Lila found it, was surprisingly brief. Martha Brennan, beloved wife and community member, had died suddenly at age 54. Cause of death was listed as heart failure. The funeral had been private, with no public service. In lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the church building fund. What struck Lila as odd was what wasn't mentioned. Martha had been active in the garden club, had volunteered at the school library, had been known throughout the county for her prize-winning preserves, yet none of these activities were referenced in the obituary. It read like the death notice of a stranger, not a woman who'd been woven into the fabric of Millfield for over 20 years. She scrolled through the weeks surrounding Martha's death, looking for any other references. What she found was even more disturbing. In its absence, no mention of any illness, no requests for prayers or support during a difficult time, no acknowledgement that anyone in the community had been suffering. It was as if Martha Brennan had simply ceased to exist one Tuesday morning, leaving behind only the most basic acknowledgement of her passing. But then, buried in the classified section of a paper from 2 weeks before Martha's death, Lila found something that made her blood run cold. Notice: residents experiencing unusual symptoms or unexplained illnesses should contact the health Department immediately. All reports will be handled with complete confidentiality. The notice ran for 3 consecutive days, then disappeared. Lila printed copies of everything she'd found and drove to the county courthouse, where vital records were kept. The clerk, a pleasant woman in her 30s whom Lila didn't recognize, was helpful in retrieving Martha Brennan's death certificate. The official cause of death was indeed listed as cardiac arrest, signed by Dr. Warren Hayes, but there was something unusual about the certificate. Itself a small notation in the corner that Lila had never seen before on any death certificate she'd encountered in her nursing career. It was a simple code, HC7. "Excuse me," she asked the clerk, "what does this notation mean?" The HC7, the woman examined the certificate, frowning slightly. "I'm not sure. It's not a standard code that I'm familiar with. You might want to contact the State Health Department. They would have records of any special designations." Lila thanked her and left with copies of the death certificate. But instead of driving back to the clinic, she found herself heading toward the cemetery behind the Methodist church. Martha Brennan's grave was in the newer section, marked by a simple granite headstone that read only her name and dates of birth and death. No beloved wife, no loving mother. She and Harold had never been able to have children. No mention of her passions or contributions to the community. Standing in the afternoon sunshine, surrounded by the graves of people she'd known and cared for, Lila felt the weight of secrets pressing down on her. The death certificate in her hand represented not just Martha's passing, but evidence of a systematic cover-up that had involved people she trusted, people she'd worked alongside for years. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Harold. 8 o'clock tonight. Come alone. Park at the old grain elevator and walk to the house. Don't bring anything that could be traced back to the clinic. Lila stared at the message, then at Martha's grave, then at the death certificate with its mysterious notation. She was 62 years old, 6 months away from retirement, and she was about to involve herself in something that could potentially destroy the career and reputation she'd spent 3 decades building. But as she walked back to her car, she realized that some things were more important than personal security. If Martha Brennan had died from something other than heart failure, if other people in Millfield were at risk, if there was a cover-up that had been ongoing for years, then she had a responsibility that went beyond her own comfort or safety. She was a nurse. Her job was to heal, to protect, to advocate for those who couldn't advocate for themselves. And right now, that meant finding out the truth about what had really killed Martha Brennan. No matter how dangerous or difficult that truth might be, the rest of the afternoon at the clinic felt like an eternity. Lila found herself checking the specimen container every hour, watching the pale creature that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm even in its confined space. By 5 o'clock, when she and Dr. Chen locked up for the day, she could barely contain her anxiety about the evening ahead. At home, she tried to maintain her normal routine or light dinner, an hour of reading, watering the tomatoes in her backyard garden, but her hands shook as she turned the pages of her book, and she found herself reading the same paragraph over and over without comprehension. When 8 o'clock finally approached, she drove to the old grain elevator on the outskirts of town, her heart hammering against her ribs. The grain elevator had been abandoned for 15 years, ever since the larger agricultural companies had consolidated their operations in the county seat. It stood like a concrete monument to farming's past, surrounded by weeds and rusted equipment that no one had bothered to haul away. Lila parked her car behind the building, as Harold had instructed, and began the quarter-mile walk to his farmhouse. The Brennan place looked different in the gathering darkness. During the day, it appeared to be a well-maintained farm with neat fields and sturdy buildings. But in the twilight, shadows seemed to lurk in unexpected places, and Lila found herself jumping at every sound. When she reached the front porch, Harold was waiting for her, his face grim in the yellow light from the overhead bulb. "Come in," he said quietly. "We need to talk." The farmhouse kitchen was exactly as Lila remembered from the few times she'd visited when Martha was alive. Worn linoleum floors, cabinets painted yellow sometime in the 1970s, a round table with mismatched chairs where Harold and Martha had shared thousands of meals. But now, it felt hollow, like a stage set waiting for actors who would never return. Harold gestured for her to sit, then disappeared into what had been Martha's sewing room. When he returned, he carried a manila folder thick with papers, medical records, Lila realized, as he set it on the table between them. "These are Martha's real medical files," he said, "not the sanitized version that ended up in the official records." Lila opened the folder with trembling hands. The first document was a laboratory report dated 6 weeks before Martha's death, signed by Dr. Warren Hayes. The results showed blood work that was completely abnormal, white blood cell counts that were off the charts, protein levels that suggested massive tissue damage, and notations about unidentified parasitic organisms found in multiple blood samples. "My God," she whispered, flipping through page after page of increasingly alarming test results. "Harold, these numbers." "Martha was dying for weeks, months," he corrected grimly. "It started almost a year before she died. First, just one bite, like what you saw on my arm today. Then more, then dozens. By the end," his voice broke, and he had to stop for a moment. "By the end, she wasn't the woman I married anymore." The medical records painted a horrifying picture. Martha's condition had deteriorated steadily as the parasitic load in her body increased. The creatures Dr. Hayes had called them unknown helminths, in his notes, seemed to feed on human tissue while releasing toxins that damaged the nervous system. Martha had experienced hallucinations, memory loss, and episodes of violent confusion in her final weeks. "But why didn't Dr. Hayes contact the state health department?" Lila asked. "This was clearly a reportable condition." Harold pulled out another document, a letter from the state health department to Dr. Hayes, dated 3 years ago. As Lila read it, her blood turned cold. "Dr. Hayes," the letter began, "we appreciate your discretion in handling the unusual medical situation in Millfield. As discussed, this matter falls under classified public health protocols established in 1952. Any disclosure of information related to these organisms or their effects on the local population could result in federal intervention that would be detrimental to the community's welfare. Please continue to treat affected individuals using the protocols we've provided, and submit monthly reports through secure channels only." The letter was signed by Dr. Patricia Vance, Director of Special Health Initiatives, and bore an official state seal that Lila had never seen before. "Classified protocols from 1952, she said. "Harold, what does this mean?" "It means this has been going on a lot longer than Martha's illness," he replied. "Dr. Hayes showed me some other records before he retired, records going back to the 1950s, when they first discovered these things in the old mine shafts, the copper mines." Harold nodded. "The mines were closed in 1948, officially because the copper played out. But the real reason was that miners started getting sick. Strange sicknesses that nobody could explain. The government stepped in, classified the whole thing, and made everyone involved sign agreements to never discuss what they'd found down there." Lila felt as though the room was spinning. "But the mines have been sealed for decades. How are people still getting infected?" "The seals don't hold forever," Harold said. "Heavy rains, shifting ground, time things break down. And when they do, these creatures find their way to the surface. Most years, nothing happens. But every few years, when conditions are just right, we get what Dr. Hayes called an emergence event." "How many people know about this?" "More than you'd think. The town council, the mayor, a few of the old-timers whose families were involved in the original cover-up, Dr. Hayes, obviously, and now Dr. Chen." Lila's head snapped up. "Margaret knows." Harold's expression was apologetic. "She's known since she arrived in Millfield. Dr. Hayes briefed her on the situation when she took over the practice. It was a condition of her employment. She had to agree to maintain the protocols and keep the secret." The betrayal hit Lila like a physical blow. Margaret had been watching her investigate, had been concerned about her questions, had offered to help with anything unusual, all while knowing exactly what Harold's bug bite really was. Her mentor, the woman she'd grown to trust and respect, had been lying to her for 8 years. "Why wasn't I told?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Hayes said you were too ethical," Harold replied. "He was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd feel obligated to report it to higher authorities. And if that happened, the federal government would step in and quarantine the entire town. They've done it before, in other places where these things have been found." Lila stared at the medical records spread across Martha's kitchen table. Everything she thought she knew about her career, her community, her relationships, was built on a foundation of lies and secrets. The people she'd dedicated her life to serving had been protecting her from a truth they believed she couldn't handle. "Harold," she said finally, "I need to see the mines." He shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous, especially at night." "I'm not asking for your permission," she said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. I'm telling you what I need to do. If I'm going to understand this situation, if I'm going to figure out how to help people, I need to see where these things come from." Harold studied her face for a long moment, then sighed heavily. Martha said the same thing near the end. She wanted to see for herself what had made her sick. "Did you take her?" "No," he said. "I've regretted that decision every day since she died. Maybe if she'd understood, maybe if she'd seen what we were really dealing with, she would have agreed to the treatments sooner." "There are treatments." Harold nodded slowly. "Dr. Hayes developed a protocol. It doesn't cure the infection, but it can slow it down, sometimes stop it completely. The problem is, it only works if you catch it early." By the time Martha was willing to try experimental treatments, it was too late. Lila closed the medical file and looked directly into Harold's tired eyes. "Take me to the mines, Harold. Tonight, I need to understand what we're really fighting." 20 minutes later, Lila found herself bouncing along a dirt road in Harold's pickup truck, heading toward the back 40 of his property where the old mining operations had left their scars on the landscape. Harold had reluctantly agreed to take her, but only after making her promise to stay close to him and follow his instructions exactly. "The mine entrances are mostly sealed with concrete," he explained as they drove through the darkness, his headlights cutting narrow swaths through the countryside. "But concrete cracks, especially after 30 years of freeze-thaw cycles. And these creatures, they're persistent when they want to get out." In the glove compartment, Harold had retrieved a rolled paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. When he handed it to her, Lila realized it was a mining survey map from 1947, showing the locations of 17 different mine shafts scattered across what was now Harold's farm and 2 neighboring properties. "This map wasn't supposed to exist," Harold said as Lila studied it by the dim dashboard light. "Government ordered all the mining records destroyed when they sealed the shafts. But my father kept a copy hidden in the barn. He was one of the miners who got sick in 1948. The map showed far more extensive mining operations than Lila had ever imagined. The shafts went deep, some marked as extending more than 300 feet into the earth, and they were interconnected by a network of tunnels that spread beneath a significant portion of the valley where Millfield sat. Harold, this suggests the mine system extends under the town itself." "Parts of it, yes. The main residential area is safe. They made sure of that when they laid out the streets in the 1920s. But some of the newer developments, the houses built in the last 20 years, are sitting right on top of sealed tunnels." Lila thought about the families she knew who lived in the newer subdivisions on the east side of town, young families with children, elderly couples who'd built retirement homes with nice views of the valley. If Harold was right, they were living directly above a network of abandoned mines that occasionally released dangerous parasites. The truck came to a stop beside a fence line marked with weathered "No Trespassing" signs. Harold pulled a flashlight from behind his seat and handed Lila a second one from the glove compartment. "Stay behind me," he said as they climbed out. "Don't touch anything unless I tell you it's safe. And if I say we're leaving, we leave immediately. No arguments." They walked through a gap in the fence and across a field that had been left fallow for years. In the beam of her flashlight, Lila could see that the ground was uneven, pocked with depressions and small sinkholes that suggested the earth beneath was unstable. After about 10 minutes of careful walking, Harold stopped and pointed his light at what looked like a concrete monument rising about 4 feet out of the ground. "Shaft number 7, he said. "This is where they found the first infected miner in 1948. Up close, Lila could see that the concrete seal was indeed cracked. A jagged fissure ran from the base, almost to the top, wide enough that she could have put her hand inside if she'd been foolish enough to try. The smell that rose from the crack was unlike anything she'd ever encountered, organic and fetid, but with an underlying mineral scent that spoke of deep earth and old stone. "The creatures come out at night," Harold explained, keeping his voice low. "Usually just a few at a time, usually only during certain weather conditions, but sometimes," he gestured toward the crack, "sometimes you can see them." As if responding to his words, something pale moved in the darkness beyond the concrete seal. Lila stepped closer despite Harold's warning gesture, shining her light into the fissure. What she saw made her stumble backward. The crack was lined with the same pale, segmented creatures she'd extracted from Harold's arm. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, clinging to the rough concrete surface like some nightmare version of earthworms. They seemed to react to the light, writhing more actively when the beam hit them directly. "They're everywhere," she whispered. "This is just one shaft," Harold replied grimly. "And this isn't even one of the worst ones." He led her to 2 more sealed shafts, each showing similar signs of structural failure and parasitic emergence. The mining map indicated they were standing above a vast underground ecosystem that had been developing for decades in the darkness below their feet. "Harold, how long has the town council known about the current situation? Not the historical, mining problems, but the active emergence of these creatures." Officially, Dr. Hayes first reported renewed activity in 1995. Unofficially, people have been finding these things on their property for years but were afraid to report them. 1995. Lila felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Harold, that's the year I got sick." She remembered that period of her life as one of the most difficult in her career. She'd been working long hours, dealing with what everyone assumed was chronic fatigue and stress-related illness. She'd lost weight, suffered from constant headaches, and experienced episodes of confusion that she'd attributed to exhaustion. Dr. Hayes had treated her with what he'd called experimental vitamins and strict rest protocols. "You were Dr. Hayes' first successful treatment," Harold said quietly. "Martha told me that much before she died. Hayes figured out how to stop the infection before it progressed too far, but only because he caught yours so early." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Her mysterious illness, Dr. Hayes' unusual treatment methods, his insistence on complete confidentiality about her condition. She'd been infected by the same parasites that had killed Martha Brennan. The only difference was that her case had been caught and treated before the creatures could establish themselves permanently in her system. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "Hayes said you'd blocked out most of the memories from that time. He thought it was better to let you believe you'd just been overworked and stressed." Lila thought back to that period, trying to remember details that had been fuzzy for 30 years. She recalled spending several nights at the clinic under observation. Treatments that Dr. Hayes had insisted were necessary but had never fully explained, and a gradual recovery that had left her feeling stronger and more focused than she'd been in years. The treatment didn't completely eliminate the infection. Harold shrugged. Hayes thought so, but he also said that once you've been infected, you might be more susceptible to reinfection. That's part of why he wanted to keep your case confidential. He was afraid that if you knew the truth, you might become paranoid about every minor illness. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the pale creatures move in the darkness. Beyond the concrete seals, Lila found herself thinking about all the patients she'd treated over the years. All the mysterious illnesses and unexplained symptoms that had puzzled her. How many of them had been related to these parasites? How many people in Millfield were walking around with infections they didn't know they had? "Harold, I need to know who else is currently infected." "I don't have those records," he said. "Hayes kept them separate from everything else, but I know there are people who've been managing their conditions for years, people who get regular checkups and treatments to keep the parasites under control. And Dr. Chen knows who they are. She has too. She's the one providing the treatments now." As they walked back toward the truck, Lila felt the weight of 30 years of lies and secrets pressing down on her. Everyone she trusted, her colleagues, her community leaders, even her own memories, had been shaped by a conspiracy that was far larger and more complex than she'd ever imagined. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that the conspiracy might not be the evil cover-up she'd initially assumed. If Harold was right, if the federal government really would quarantine the entire town if they learned about the ongoing parasite problem, then maybe the people who'd been keeping these secrets were actually heroes, not villains. The question was, what was she going to do with the truth now that she finally had it? The next morning, Lila arrived at the clinic an hour early, her mind churning with everything she'd learned the night before. She'd barely slept, spending most of the dark hours staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile 30 years of memories with the truth Harold had revealed. Now, as she unlocked the clinic door and stepped into the familiar space, everything felt different, charged with secrets and weighted with deception. She went directly to Dr. Chun's office, not to snoop but to try to understand how she'd missed the signs of her colleagues' involvement in the cover-up. Margaret was meticulous about her record-keeping, organized to a fault, and utterly professional in all her interactions. How had she managed to hide such a massive secret for 8 years? The answer, Lila realized, was that Margaret hadn't hidden it at all. She'd simply never had reason to discuss it with someone who wasn't supposed to. No, When Margaret arrived at 8:30, she found Lila sitting in the waiting room with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that immediately put her on alert. "Good morning," Margaret said carefully. "You're here early." "We need to talk," Lila replied, handing her one of the coffee cups, privately. They settled into Margaret's office with the door closed. Lila had rehearsed this conversation during her sleepless night, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself struggling to find the right words. "I know about the parasites," she said finally. "I know about the mining operations, the government cover-up, Dr. Hayes' treatment protocols. I know that you've been treating infected patients for 8 years, and I know that you've been keeping all of this secret from me." Margaret's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other across the desk that had been witness to countless difficult conversations over the years. "How did you find out?" Margaret asked quietly. "Harold Brennan. He showed me Martha's real medical records last night." Margaret set down her coffee with careful precision. "Lila, I want you to understand. I need to see them," Lila interrupted. "The current patients, the ones you're treating now. I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. I can't do that. Patient confidentiality, don't." Lila's voice was sharper than she'd intended. "Don't hide behind medical ethics when you've been lying to me for 8 years. These people are my community too. I've been caring for them, worrying about their health, treating their symptoms without understanding what was really wrong with them." Margaret was quiet for a long time, and Lila could see her weighing options, considering consequences. Finally, she reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a keyring with several keys that Lila had never seen before. "There's a locked filing cabinet in the supply room," Margaret said. "The patient files you're looking for are in there. But Lila, you see them, you'll be as complicit in this as the rest of us. You won't be able to pretend ignorance anymore." "I crossed that line the moment I extracted a living parasite from Harold's arm and didn't report it to the state health department." Margaret led her to the supply room and unlocked a filing cabinet that Lila had assumed contained old equipment, manuals. Instead, it held medical files for 17 current patients, people Lila knew, people she saw at the grocery store and the post office, people whose families she'd been treating for decades. The names on the files made her stomach clench. Jim Kowalski, the hardware store owner; Sarah Beth Morrison, the librarian; Tom and Elena Rodriguez, Maria's elderly in-laws; Mrs. Patterson, whose blood pressure she'd checked just yesterday morning; even Mayor Davidson, who'd been running the town for over a decade. "My God," Lila whispered, opening Jim Kowalski's file. "How many people in this town are infected, currently?" 17 that we know of. But Lila, you have to understand, these people are living normal lives. The treatment protocols work. Most of them have been managing their conditions for years, without any significant health impacts." Lila flipped through the files, reading treatment notes and lab results that painted a picture of careful, ongoing medical management, regular blood work, monthly medication adjustments, quarterly examinations that she'd never been told about. Dr. Chen had been running a parallel medical practice right under her nose. Jim Kowalski's file showed that he'd been infected in 2003, probably from working in his basement workshop where an old mine tunnel had partially collapsed. His current parasite load was described as stable and well-controlled. The joint pain he'd been complaining about wasn't arthritis, it was a side effect of the medication that kept the creatures dormant. Sarah Beth Morrison's infection dated back to 2007, when she'd been cataloging books stored in the library basement and had encountered what she'd thought was a water leak from a broken pipe. The water had actually been seepage from a compromised mine shaft. Her occasional dizzy spells, which she'd attributed to working too many late hours, were actually symptoms of low-level parasitic activity. Mrs. Patterson's case was the most recent, infected just 18 months ago, while gardening near a sinkhole that had opened in her backyard after heavy spring rains. Her high blood pressure wasn't caused by stress or aging. It was her body's response to the ongoing infection. "They all trust you," Lila said, looking up from the files. "They come in for their regular appointments, follow their treatment schedules, never question why they need such unusual medications." "They know what they have," Margaret replied. "They've all been fully informed about their conditions and the risks involved. The secrecy isn't about hiding the truth from them, it's about protecting the entire community from federal intervention." As Lila continued reading, she found a bundle of letters in the back of the filing cabinet, correspondence between Dr. Chen and various state health officials that detailed the ongoing situation in Millfield. The letters revealed a complex relationship between local medical providers and state authorities, with carefully negotiated protocols for managing what the state called Classified Health Event 7. The HC7 designation from Martha's death certificate suddenly made sense. It wasn't a random code, was a classification system for communities dealing with parasitic infections related to old mining operations. According to the correspondence, there were at least 6 other towns in 3 states that were managing similar situations under federal oversight. "We're not the only ones," Lila said. "No, this is a known problem that's been ongoing for decades. The difference is that most communities haven't been as successful as Millfield in managing the infections without losing people." Losing people. Like Martha, Margaret's expression grew sad. Martha's case was complicated. She was infected multiple times over several years before anyone realized what was happening. By the time Dr. Hayes identified the parasites, her body was overwhelmed. "The treatment protocols work best when we catch the infections early." Lila closed the files and looked at Margaret directly. "Why wasn't I told from the beginning?" "Harold," said Dr. Hayes, "thought I was too ethical, but that's not really an explanation." "Because you were a survivor," Margaret said quietly. "Dr. Hayes treated your infection in 1995, but he was never entirely certain that he'd eliminated it completely. He wanted to monitor you without making you paranoid about every symptom, every minor illness. When I took over the practice, he asked me to continue that monitoring. So for 8 years, you've been watching me for signs of reinfection. For 8 years, I've been grateful that you've remained healthy and asymptomatic. Your recovery gave Dr. Hayes hope that early intervention could save other patients. Everything we know about successful treatment is based on what worked for you." The weight of this revelation settled over Lila like a heavy blanket. She wasn't just a nurse who'd stumbled onto her community's dark secret. She was an integral part of that secret. The first success story in a decades-long medical experiment. "What happens now?" she asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," Margaret replied. "You can walk away from all of this, pretend you never learned the truth, and enjoy your retirement in 6 months. Or you can help us. There's always been a gap in our care. We've never had a nurse who understood the full situation, someone who could coordinate treatment and provide the kind of comprehensive care these patients deserve." Lila looked around the supply room that had been hiding 17 medical files, each representing a life that had been forever changed by something that had crawled out of the darkness beneath their town. People she'd known for decades. People who'd been carrying this burden in secret while trusting that their medical providers would keep them safe. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course, but Lila, whatever you decide, these people are going to need medical care for the rest of their lives. The question is whether that care comes from providers who understand their community and care about their welfare, or from federal health officials who see them as research subjects rather than neighbors." As Lila left the clinic that afternoon, she carried with her not just the knowledge of her town's secrets, but the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She could retreat into the comfortable ignorance of retirement, or she could step forward into a role she'd never imagined as the guardian of truths too dangerous to share and protector of people too precious to abandon. 3 days passed before Lila made her decision. 3 days of restless nights, long walks through town where she looked at familiar faces with new eyes, and careful conversations that skirted around the edges of truths she couldn't yet speak aloud. On Friday afternoon, she found herself back at the clinic after hours, using her key to enter the building when she was certain she'd be alone. She needed to see her own medical records. Margaret kept the main patient files in standard cabinets, but Lila suspected that her own records, if they existed in their complete form, would be hidden somewhere more secure. She started with Dr. Chun's office, methodically searching through desk drawers and filing cabinets for anything that might contain information about her 1995 illness. It was in the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet, buried beneath outdated medical journals and conference materials, that she found a manila envelope with her name written in Dr. Hayes' distinctive handwriting. Inside were medical records she'd never seen before, records that told a story far different from what she remembered about her illness 30 years ago. According to Dr. Hayes' notes, her condition in 1995 had been far more serious than anyone had ever told her. The initial infection had been massive, with parasite counts that should have been fatal. She'd been unconscious for 3 days, not the overnight observation she remembered. Her recovery had been so remarkable that Dr. Hayes had documented every detail, creating what he called the prototype for parasitic intervention therapy. But it was the final document in the envelope that made Lila's hands shake as she read it. A laboratory report dated 6 months after her recovery, showing that the parasites hadn't been eliminated from her system, they'd been transformed. Instead of the aggressive, tissue-destroying organisms that had killed Martha and threatened so many others, Lila's immune system had somehow converted them into something symbiotic. The creatures in her bloodstream were still alive, still reproducing, but they were no longer parasitic. According to Dr. Hayes' notes, they appeared to be actively beneficial, boosting her immune system, accelerating tissue repair, and providing protection against reinfection that was absolute. Lila Mathers wasn't a survivor of parasitic infection, was a successful host for a mutated strain of the organisms that had become benevolent. And she'd been living with them, unknowingly, for 30 years. The medical records included monthly blood work that Dr. Hayes had conducted in secret, documenting the ongoing presence of what he termed beneficial organisms in her system. When Dr. Chen had taken over the practice, she'd continued the monitoring, tracking the creature's evolution and Lila's remarkably stable health. At 62, Lila's blood work showed the cellular activity of someone 20 years younger, with immune markers that were off the charts and healing factors that explained why she'd never taken a sick day in recent memory. Lila sat in the darkened office, staring at laboratory results that redefined everything she thought she knew about herself. She wasn't just the first successful treatment, she was proof that the parasites could evolve, that the relationship between the creatures and their human hosts didn't have to be destructive. I was wondering when you'd find those. Lila spun around to find Dr. Chun standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. How long have you been here? Lila asked. About 10 minutes. I saw your car in the parking lot and figured you'd finally decided to look for your own records. Margaret stepped into the office and closed the door behind her. I'm surprised it took you this long. Honestly, you knew I'd find them eventually. I hoped you would. There are things we need to discuss, things that go beyond the basic treatment protocols you've learned about. Margaret sat down across from Lila, her demeanor more serious than usual. What you've discovered about your own condition, it's the key to everything we've been trying to accomplish here. The other patients, the ones with managed infections, they're all receiving treatments based on blood samples from you. My blood modified synthetic versions of the beneficial organisms in your system. Dr. Hayes developed the process in the late 1990s, using your blood as a template to create therapeutic agents that could convert parasitic infections into symbiotic relationships. It doesn't work for everyone, and it has to be administered within a specific time frame after infection. But when it does work, people like Jim Kowalski and Sarah Beth get to live normal lives, better than normal lives, in many cases. Enhanced immune systems, accelerated healing, protection against a wide range of diseases. The people in our treatment program haven't had so much as a common cold in years. Lila thought about her own health over the past 3 decades. She'd assumed her robust constitution was simply good genetics combined with an active lifestyle. Now she understood that she'd been carrying within her bloodstream a biological revolution that could transform medicine's understanding of parasitic relationships. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because we needed you to live a normal life. If you'd known you were carrying modified organisms in your bloodstream, if you'd been constantly worried about your condition or trying to study it, the stress alone might have disrupted the symbiotic balance. Dr. Hayes believed that your psychological state was as important as your physical condition in maintaining the beneficial relationship. Margaret pulled out another file from her desk, thicker than the others, marked with security classifications that Lila had never seen on medical documents. There's something else you need to know, Margaret said. The work we're doing here, the research based on your condition, it's not just local anymore. The federal health authorities who've been monitoring our situation have been sharing our data with research facilities across the country. Your blood samples have contributed to treatments that have saved lives in Ohio, Montana, and New Mexico. The implications hit Lila like a wave. Her body hadn't just been harboring beneficial organisms, it had been serving as a biological laboratory for developing treatments that were being used nationwide. For 30 years, without her knowledge or consent, she'd been an unwilling participant in a medical research program that spanned multiple states. You've been using me, she said quietly. "We've been learning from you," Margaret corrected. "And yes, we should have told you. Dr. Hayes made that decision, and I've continued to honor it, but I've always believed you had a right to know." Lila looked again at the laboratory reports showing the remarkable stability of her condition. Over 3 decades, the beneficial organisms in her system had not only survived, but thrived, creating a biological environment that was uniquely resistant to disease and aging. What would happen if I stopped cooperating? If I refused to provide blood samples or participate in monitoring? Honestly, nothing would happen to you. Your condition is self-sustaining now. The organisms in your system don't require any external support or intervention. But the research program would suffer, and new patients with fresh infections might not have access to the treatments that could save their lives. The weight of responsibility settled over Lila with crushing force. She wasn't just a retired nurse anymore. She was a walking medical miracle whose body held the key to treatments that could save lives across multiple communities. The decision about her retirement had become infinitely more complex. How many other people know about my condition? Very few. Dr. Hayes, myself, and 3 researchers at the State Health Department who've been involved in developing the synthetic treatments. The patients who received the therapies don't know where they originated. Lila stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet streets of Millfield where 17 people were living with managed infections, protected by treatments derived from her own blood. People who trusted her to care for them, who had no idea that their continued health depended on her cooperation with a research program she'd never agreed to join. "I need time to process this," she said. "Of course. But Lila, there's one more thing. We've detected some unusual activity in the mine systems recently. Ground-penetrating radar shows that several new chambers have opened up following the spring floods. If we're right about what that means, we might be facing a much larger emergence event than anything we've dealt with before." How much larger? Potentially affecting hundreds of people instead of dozens. And with that many new infections, we'd need to scale up treatment production significantly. We'd need much more frequent blood samples, more comprehensive monitoring, and your active participation in refining the therapeutic protocols. Lila turned back to face Margaret, seeing in her colleague's expression the same mixture of hope and desperation that had probably driven Dr. Hayes for years. The comfortable fiction of her approaching retirement had been shattered, replaced by the stark reality that she might be the most important person in Millfield, not because of her nursing skills, but because of the microscopic creatures living in her bloodstream. "I'll give you my answer on Monday," she said finally. As she drove home through the familiar streets of her hometown, Lila realized that her decision would affect not just her own future, but the lives of potentially hundreds of people she'd never met. The quiet retirement she'd been planning had become impossible, but perhaps it had always been an illusion. Some responsibilities, she was beginning to understand, couldn't be set aside simply because they were inconvenient or unwanted. Over the weekend, Lila found herself walking the streets of Millfield with new eyes, seeing her community through the lens of everything she'd learned. On Saturday morning, she stopped by Kowalski Hardware to pick up some gardening supplies and found herself studying Jim's movements, looking for any signs of the infection she now knew he carried. He seemed entirely normal, his usual gruff humor, his detailed knowledge of every bolt and screw in the store, his obvious pleasure in helping customers solve their problems. "You feeling all right, Lila?" he asked as she lingered near the checkout counter. "You look like you've got something on your mind." "Just thinking about retirement," she said, which was true in a way she couldn't begin to explain. "Well, you've earned it. 30 years of taking care of all of us, time for someone to take care of you for a change." If only he knew, Lila thought, that taking care of everyone might be exactly what she was being called to continue doing, just in a way she'd never imagined. Sunday morning found her at the Methodist church, sitting in the same pew she'd occupied for 40 years, listening to Pastor Williams deliver a sermon about calling and purpose that felt uncomfortably relevant to her situation. Around her sat the faces she'd known for decades: Mrs. Patterson in her usual spot, 3 rows ahead; Sarah Beth Morrison near the back with her weekly stack of library books; the Rodriguez family with their children fidgeting in their Sunday clothes. How many of them knew the town's secret? How many were living with infections they couldn't discuss publicly? How many trusted that their medical care would continue to be available, no matter what? After the service, Sarah Beth approached her in the parking lot, her expression unusually serious. "Lila, could I speak with you for a moment?" Privately, they walked to a quiet corner of the churchyard, away from the usual post-service socializing. Sarah Beth glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I know you've been asking questions about Martha Brennan's death, and I know Dr. Chen has been having some unusual conversations with you this week." Lila felt her heart skip a beat. "Sarah Beth, I'm one of them," she said simply. "One of the people Dr. Chen treats for the condition. And I wanted you to know that whatever you're thinking about doing, whatever decisions you're facing with, trust you, all of us. How many people know that I know?" Word spreads quickly in a small town, even when people are trying to be discreet. Harold told Jim. Jim mentioned something to his wife. She talked to Mrs. Patterson. You know how it goes. Lila did know. In Millfield, secrets were hard to keep unless everyone involved had a strong motivation to keep them. And this secret had been kept for decades because everyone understood the stakes. "Are you afraid?" Lila asked. Sarah Beth was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I was, at first. When Dr. Chen explained what I had, what it could do to me if left untreated, yes, I was terrified. But that was 7 years ago. Now," she shrugged, "I feel better than I have in my entire adult life. I haven't been sick once since starting the treatments. I have more energy, better focus, and I've been able to tackle projects at the library that I never thought I'd have the stamina for." "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you'd never been infected?" "Sometimes, but then I think about the alternative, what would have happened if I'd been infected and Dr. Chen hadn't been here to treat me, if I'd ended up like Martha Brennan." Sarah Beth shivered slightly. "I choose to be grateful for what I have now, rather than mourning what I've lost." That afternoon, Lila drove to the cemetery to visit her husband's grave, something she did every few weeks when she needed to think through difficult decisions. Robert had been gone for 8 years now, taken by a sudden heart attack that had given them no time to say goodbye. But sitting beside his headstone, she often found clarity that eluded her elsewhere. "I don't know what to do, Robert," she said aloud, not caring if anyone thought she was talking to herself. "Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my work, about this town, it's all been turned upside down." She told him about the parasites, about her own infection and recovery, about the 17 people whose lives depended on treatments derived from her blood. She explained about the potential emergence event that could affect hundreds more people, and the impossible choice between retirement and a responsibility she'd never asked for. "You always said that when we don't know what to do, we should think about what would help the most people," she said. "But what if helping people means living a lie for the rest of my life? What if it means becoming part of a conspiracy that goes against everything I was taught about medical ethics?" The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that shaded Robert's grave. In the distance, she could see Harold Brennan working in his fields, the bandage on his arm hidden beneath his long sleeves. He'd made his choice 30 years ago when he'd agreed to keep the town's secret. Now it was her turn. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and humidity that made everyone in Millfield a little uncomfortable. Lila arrived at the clinic to find Dr. Chen already there, along with 2 people she didn't recognize, a man and woman in their 40s. Dressed in business attire that was slightly too formal for a small-town medical clinic, Lila Margaret said as she entered, "I'd like you to meet Dr. Patricia Vance from the State Health Department and Dr. Michael Torres from the Centers for Disease Control." Dr. Vance was the name Lila recognized from the letters she'd found, the director of special health initiatives who'd been corresponding with Dr. Hayes for years. She was a small, precise woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Ms. Mathers," Dr. Vance said, extending her hand, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Your contribution to our research program has been invaluable." Dr. Torres was younger, probably in his early 40s, with the earnest demeanor of someone who devoted his career to public health. "We've been hoping to discuss the situation in Millfield with you directly. Dr. Chen tells us you've recently learned about your role in our treatment protocols." "My role that I never consented to," Lila said bluntly. "That's a fair point," Dr. Vance acknowledged. "And it's something we need to address. But first, we need to brief you on some recent developments that may affect your decision about future participation." They moved to the conference room that was usually used for staff meetings. Dr. Torres opened a laptop and pulled up a series of satellite images that showed the area around Millfield from above. "These are ground-penetrating radar images taken last week," he explained, The spring flooding has caused significant changes to the underground mine system. We estimate that at least 12 previously sealed chambers have been compromised. The images showed dark voids beneath the earth where solid rock should have been, connected by a network of tunnels that seemed to extend far beyond what the original mining maps had indicated. What does this mean in practical terms? Lila asked. We're looking at a potential emergence event that could affect anywhere from 200 to 500 people, Dr. Vance said, possibly more, depending on weather conditions and the creature's reproductive cycles. 500 people. Lila felt the room spinning slightly. In a town of 1,500. The good news is that we have advance warning this time, Dr. Torres said. We can implement preventive measures, establish treatment protocols, and coordinate with local medical providers before the emergence begins. The challenging news, Dr. Vance continued, is that our current synthetic treatment supplies are insufficient for an event of this magnitude. We'd need to scale up production dramatically, which means we'd need much more frequent blood draws from you, and we'd need your active participation in refining the treatment protocols. Margaret spread out a document that looked like a medical research proposal. They're asking you to formally join the research program as a partner rather than an unknowing participant. Full disclosure of what's involved, compensation for your time and contribution, and a voice in how the program is managed going forward. Lila scanned the document, noting the detailed schedule of blood draws, medical monitoring, and research participation that would be required. It wasn't a part-time commitment, it was essentially a new career, one that would make her retirement impossible but would also make her one of the most important people in a nationwide medical research program. What happens if I say no? We respect your right to refuse, Dr. Vance said, but we'd have to rely on synthetic treatments that are less effective and have higher failure rates. Some people who could be saved with the improved protocols might be lost. And if I say yes, you become the cornerstone of a treatment program that could eventually help thousands of people in communities across the country, Dr. Torres said. We're not just talking about Millfield anymore. We're talking about establishing protocols that could be used anywhere these organisms emerge. Lila looked around the table at the three faces watching her expectantly. Margaret, who'd become both colleague and friend over the past 8 years, Dr. Vance, who represented decades of careful research and government oversight, Dr. Torres, whose obvious passion for public health reminded her of her own younger self. I need to see the treatment journal, she said finally. I'm sorry. Dr. Vance looked confused. Dr. Hayes kept detailed records of his treatment protocols, his research notes, his observations about the beneficial organisms. If I'm going to make this decision, I need to understand exactly what he learned during the 30 years he was developing these treatments. Margaret and Dr. Vance exchanged glances. Some of those records are classified, Dr. Vance said carefully. Then declassify them, Lila said firmly. If you want me to become a full partner in this program, I need full access to the information. All of it. Dr. Torres leaned forward. Ms. Mathers, what would it take for you to say yes to this partnership? Lila thought about Sarah Beth's words in the churchyard, about Harold's decades of carrying secrets, about the 17 people whose health depended on treatments she'd never known she was providing. She thought about Martha Brennan, who might have lived if the treatments had been available sooner. Complete transparency, she said. No more secrets, no more hidden monitoring, no more making decisions about my body or my blood without my knowledge. And I want to meet the other patients, all of them, so I can understand exactly who I'm being asked to help. That can be arranged, Dr. Vance said. And I want guarantees that this community will be protected, no matter what happens. No federal quarantines, no forced relocations, no destroying people's lives in the name of public health. We can work within those parameters, Dr. Torres agreed. Lila looked out the conference room window at the familiar streets of Millfield, where people were going about their Monday morning routines without knowing that their world was about to change again. In 6 hours, she'd gone from planning her retirement to considering a role that would make her integral to medical research for the rest of her life. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, she said. But first, I want to see everything. Tuesday morning brought with it the most comprehensive medical briefing of Lila's life. Dr. Vance had been true to her word. Every document, every research note, every classified report from the past 30 years was spread across the conference table like pieces of a massive puzzle that was finally being assembled for her to see. Dr. Hayes' treatment journal was a leather-bound volume that looked more like a scholar's research diary than a medical document. His handwriting filled page after page with observations, theories, and detailed case studies that painted a picture of a man who'd devoted his career to understanding something that defied conventional medical knowledge. Patient 0, he'd written in an entry dated March 15, 1995, presents with massive parasitic load, but demonstrates unprecedented immune response. Instead of tissue destruction, organisms appear to be triggering beneficial mutations in host cellular structure. Hypothesis: some individuals may possess genetic markers that allow for symbiotic rather than parasitic relationship. That patient had been her. As Lila read through the journal, she discovered that her case had been far more remarkable than even the medical records had suggested. Dr. Hayes had documented not just her recovery, but the evolution of the organisms in her system. Over months and years, the creatures had continued to adapt, becoming more beneficial over time, creating what he termed the perfect biological partnership. The implications are staggering. One entry read, "If we can understand what makes LMS immune system convert parasitic organisms into beneficial symbionts, we may be looking at a revolution in medical treatment, not just for these specific parasites, but for a wide range of infectious diseases." Dr. Torres had brought additional files that showed how Dr. Hayes' research had been expanded and applied in other communities. The treatment protocols developed from Lila's blood had been used successfully in Ohio mining towns, former copper mining areas in Montana, and abandoned iron ore regions in Minnesota. Over the past decade, they'd saved hundreds of lives. "Your blood," Dr. Vance explained, "contains the template for something we've never seen before in medical science. Organisms that actively improve human health while living in symbiosis with their host. The synthetic versions we've developed are effective, but they're approximations. The real breakthrough will come when we can understand why your immune system achieved what no one else's has." Margaret pulled out a vial containing a clear liquid, the experimental treatment serum, that represented the latest development in the research program. "This is the current version of the synthetic treatment, based on the most recent analysis of your blood samples. It's more effective than anything Dr. Hayes was able to develop, but we still have a failure rate of about 15%. 15% of people who receive this treatment don't survive. 15% don't achieve full symbiosis," Dr. Torres corrected. "Most of them survive but require ongoing medical management to keep the parasites under control. It's people like Jim Kowalski and Sarah Beth, healthy and functional, but dependent on regular treatments. And the other 85%, they achieve something approaching what you have. Long-term symbiosis with significant health benefits, enhanced immune function, accelerated healing, protection against a wide range of diseases." Lila set down the journal and looked around the table at the three people who'd been managing this situation for years. "What you're telling me is that my body holds the key to turning a deadly parasite into a beneficial organism for most people who are infected." "That's exactly what we're telling you," Dr. Vance said. "And if we can perfect the treatment, if we can get the success rate closer to 100%, we could potentially eliminate the threat these creatures pose to any community where they emerge." "More than that," Dr. Torres said, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of a researcher discussing his life's work, "we could potentially offer people enhanced health and longevity. The symbiotic organisms in your system appear to slow the aging process, boost cognitive function, and provide resistance to cancer and heart disease." The implications were staggering. Lila was looking at research that could fundamentally change human medicine, and she was the key to all of it. Her blood, her immune system, her accidental symbiosis with creatures from an abandoned minet, all represented possibilities that could help millions of people. But it also represented the end of any hope for a normal retirement, the end of privacy about her medical condition, and the beginning of a life where her body would be as much a research laboratory as it was her own. "What about the people in Millfield?" she asked. "The ones who are already infected but not achieving full symbiosis? With improved treatments based on more detailed analysis of your blood, we believe we could help them achieve better outcomes," Margaret said. "Jim's joint pain could be eliminated. Sarah Beth's occasional dizzy spells could be resolved. Mrs. Patterson might not need blood pressure medication anymore. And Harold's infection is more recent and less established. With the right treatment, he could achieve full symbiosis within 6 months." Lila thought about Harold, about the fear in his eyes when she'd extracted the creature from his arm, about the decades he'd spent carrying the secret of his wife's death. She thought about all the other Harold Brennans in mining communities across the country. People who might be facing the same choice between accepting a dangerous infection and risking their community's exposure. If I agree to this partnership, she said slowly, what exactly would my role be? Dr. Vance pulled out a detailed job description that looked more like a research position at a major university than anything Lila had ever considered. You'd be our lead consultant on symbiotic parasite treatment, regular blood draws for analysis, participation in treatment development, and coordination of care for infected patients. Essentially, you'd become the medical director for communities dealing with parasitic emergence events. It was everything Lila had never wanted and everything her community desperately needed. A chance to help people on a scale she'd never imagined, but also a responsibility that would define the rest of her life. I need to see the mine sites one more time, she said. And I need to meet with the infected patients as a group. If I'm going to make this decision, I want everyone involved to understand what we're committing to. That can be arranged, Dr. Torres said. When would you like to do this? Lila looked at the treatment serum sitting on the table, knowing that it represented hope for hundreds of people but also the end of her quiet life in Millfield. Tonight, she said. If we're really facing an emergence event that could affect 500 people, we don't have time to waste. That evening, 17 people gathered in the fellowship hall of the Methodist Church, every person in Millfield who was living with a managed parasitic infection. Lila had walked into this building thousands of times over the past 40 years, but tonight it felt different, charged with the weight of secrets finally being shared and decisions that would affect all their lives. Harold sat in the front row, his bandaged arm resting on his knee. Beside him were Jim Kowalski and his wife Martha, Sarah Beth Morrison with her usual stack of books, Mrs. Patterson looking more nervous than Lila had ever seen her, and Mayor Davidson, whose infection Lila hadn't even suspected until she'd seen his medical file. The Rodriguez family occupied an entire punit, just Tom and Alina, but their daughter Maria and two of their grandchildren, teenagers who'd been infected during a family camping trip near one of the compromised mine sites. Dr. Chen stood at the front of the room with a formal document that looked like it had been prepared by a team of lawyers, the town council resolution from 1998 that had established the secret protocols for managing the ongoing parasitic threat. Before we begin, Margaret said, I want everyone to understand that what we discussed tonight will determine how this community moves forward. We're facing decisions that will affect not just our own health, but the welfare of potentially hundreds of other people. She read aloud from the resolution, a document that Lila realized represented one of the most remarkable acts of collective courage she'd ever encountered. In 1998, faced with a federal threat to quarantine their town and destroy their way of life, the people of Millfield had chosen to manage the parasitic infections themselves, accepting the risks and responsibilities that came with keeping such a dangerous secret. The question before us now, Margaret continued, is whether we're prepared to expand our role, from protecting our own community to helping other communities facing similar threats. Mayor Davidson stood up, his usual political composure replaced by the straightforward manner of someone who'd been carrying this burden for decades. Lila, I want you to know that this decision isn't just yours to make. All of us have a say in what happens next, because all of us will be affected by the consequences. I appreciate that, Lila replied, but I also want all of you to understand what accepting this partnership would mean. My blood samples would be used to develop treatments for people across the country. Our community would become a research center for studying these organisms, and we'd be taking responsibility for managing emergence events in other mining communities. Sarah Beth raised her hand tentatively. Would that mean more federal oversight? More government officials involved in our medical care? Dr. Vance, who'd been sitting quietly in the back of the room, stood to address the group. Actually, it would mean less federal oversight. Right now, our involvement in Millfield is classified and limited. If we formalize this partnership, if we establish this community as a research and treatment center, you'd have much more control over how the program is managed. What about our privacy? Asked Maria Rodriguez. My children are infected. I don't want them to become research subjects. They already are research subjects, Dr. Torres said gently. The difference is that now you'd have a voice in how that research is conducted, and your children would have access to improved treatments that could eliminate the need for ongoing medical management. Jim Kowalski shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lila, you've been taking care of all of us for 30 years. If you think this is the right thing to do, I trust your judgment. I appreciate that, Jim. But this can't be just about trusting my judgment. This has to be a decision we all make together, understanding the full implications. Harold cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. I've been thinking about this since Martha died, about the secrets we've been keeping, the lies we've been telling, the way we've been managing this situation. And I keep coming back to one question. Are we protecting people, or are we just protecting ourselves? The room fell silent as Harold's words sank in. Lila realized he was articulating something she'd been struggling with since learning the truth about the town's situation. Martha died because we caught her infection too late, Harold continued. Other people in other towns are probably dying right now because they don't have access to the treatments we've developed here. If Lila's blood can save those people, if our experience can help other communities avoid the mistakes we made, we have an obligation to share that. Mrs. Patterson spoke up from her usual spot, 3 rows from the front. But what if something goes wrong? What if this partnership brings unwanted attention to our town? What if the federal government decides to shut down the program and quarantine us anyway? Those are real risks, Dr. Vance acknowledged. But the alternative, continuing to manage this situation in isolation while other communities struggle with similar problems, isn't sustainable either. The emergence events are becoming more frequent as climate change affects groundwater levels and soil stability. We need a coordinated response. Lila looked around the room at the faces of people she'd known for decades, people who'd been living with this secret and managing their health conditions with remarkable grace and resilience. She thought about the teenagers in the Rodriguez family, who'd been infected so young that they'd never known life without the beneficial organisms in their bloodstreams. She thought about Harold, still grieving his wife's death and carrying guilt about decisions made decades ago. I want to read you something, she said, pulling out Dr. Hayes' treatment journal. This is from his notes about my case in 1995. She found the passage she'd marked earlier and read aloud. The goal is not just to treat infection, but to transform the relationship between human and organism, from parasitic to beneficial. If we can achieve this consistently, we're not just saving lives, we're offering people the chance to live better lives than they ever thought possible. She closed the journal and looked directly at each person in the room. Dr. Hayes saw something in my case that went beyond just medical treatment. He saw the possibility of genuine improvement in human health and well-being. The question is, are we prepared to help make that possibility available to others? The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Sarah Beth Morrison, the quiet librarian who'd spent her life surrounded by other people's stories, stood up. I vote yes, she said simply. It's time for us to stop hiding and start helping. 6 months later, Lila Mathers stood in what had once been the Millfield Community Health Clinic and was now the Regional Center for Parasitic Symbiosis Research. The familiar yellow Victorian house had been expanded with a modern laboratory, wing, additional examination rooms, and a conference center where medical professionals from across the country came to learn about treatment protocols that had saved over 400 lives in the past half year. Her retirement had been postponed indefinitely, but she'd never felt more fulfilled in her career. The morning brought its usual mix of routine checkups and research activities. Harold Brennan arrived for his monthly blood work, his infection, now completely stabilized and his health better than it had been in decades. The joint pain that had bothered him for years was gone, and his energy levels rivaled those of men 20 years younger. How's the arm feeling? Lila asked as she drew his blood sample. Better than new, he replied with a smile that came more easily these days. Martha would be amazed at how this all turned out. Jim Kowalski had become something of a poster patient for the research program. His transformation from someone managing chronic pain to someone with enhanced health and vitality had been so remarkable that Dr. Torres had featured his case in a presentation to the World Health Organization. Jim still ran the hardware store, but now he also served on the advisory board that helped guide the research program's community outreach efforts. Sarah Beth Morrison had been promoted to Community Liaison Coordinator, a position that combined her natural organizational skills with her deep understanding of how to help communities adapt to extraordinary circumstances. She'd developed protocols for introducing infected patients to their diagnoses and treatment options, making the process less frightening and more empowering. The new medical protocol manual that Lila had spent months developing sat prominently on her desk, a comprehensive guide for treating parasitic infections that ensured the knowledge would never again be lost or hidden. The manual had already been distributed to medical facilities in 7 states, with more requesting copies every week. Dr. Chun had been promoted to Director of Clinical Research, overseeing a team of specialists who came to Millfield from universities and medical centers around the world. The quiet small-town clinic had become a destination for some of the brightest minds in parasitology and immunology, all working to understand and replicate the remarkable symbiosis that had developed in Lila's bloodstream. The teenagers in the Rodriguez family had become junior ambassadors for the program, sharing their experiences with other young people who'd been infected, and helping to normalize what could have been a terrifying diagnosis. Their grandmother Alina had started a support group for families dealing with parasitic infections, providing the kind of emotional support that medical protocols alone couldn't address. Mrs. Patterson had become the program's most unlikely success story. At 70, she'd achieved complete symbiosis and no longer needed any medication for her blood pressure or the arthritis that had bothered her for years. She'd started training for a marathon, something she'd never imagined possible at her age. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community itself. The burden of keeping dangerous secrets had been replaced by the pride of being at the forefront of medical research that was helping people around the world. Millfield had gone from a town hiding a dark truth to a community leading the way in understanding how humans and other organisms could live together beneficially. Dr. Mathers called Dr. Torres from the laboratory doorway, still grinning at the title that Lila had never expected to hold. The university had awarded her an honorary doctorate in recognition of her contribution to medical research, making her one of the few people in history to receive such recognition based primarily on the properties of her own blood. The latest batch of synthetic treatments tested perfectly, he continued. We're now achieving a 96% success rate in new infections, and the long-term health benefits are exceeding our most optimistic projections. Lila nodded, feeling the satisfaction that came from knowing her decision had led to tangible improvements in medical care. The enhanced treatments had been used successfully in Montana, Ohio, New Mexico, and most recently in a former mining community in Wales where similar organisms had emerged after unprecedented flooding. As the day wound down, Lila found herself walking through downtown Millfield, observing the changes that had come with their new prominence. The old grain elevator had been converted into a research library. A new hotel accommodated visiting researchers and medical professionals. The Methodist Church had expanded its fellowship hall to host the monthly community meetings, where research progress was shared with residents. But underneath all the changes, Millfield remained fundamentally the same community. It had always been a place where people looked out for each other, where everyone knew their neighbors, where the hardware store was still the center of local gossip and the library remained the heart of community life. Harold Brennan's farmhouse looked peaceful in the evening light as Lila drove past on her way home. The mine shafts on his property had been properly sealed with new materials that would last for generations, eliminating the source of random infections while preserving access for controlled research. The dark secrets that had haunted his family for decades had been transformed into hope for people around the world. At home, Lila sat in her garden among the tomatoes and roses she'd been tending for 40 years, reviewing the latest research reports and planning for the medical conference where she'd be presenting next month. Her blood work that morning had shown the continued stable presence of the beneficial organisms that had made all of this possible, and her health remained remarkably robust for someone approaching her 63rd birthday. The career she'd thought was ending had been transformed into something she could never have imagined when she'd first put on a nurse's uniform 30 years ago. Instead of retirement, she'd found a new calling that combined her passion for healing with her commitment to her community and her unexpected role as a pioneer in medical research. Some people, she reflected, discover their greatest purpose late in life. She'd always thought her legacy would be the patients she'd cared for and the families she'd comforted during difficult times. Now she understood that her real legacy might be the medical breakthroughs that would help people she'd never meet, in communities she'd never visit, for generations to come. The sun set over Millfield, casting long shadows across the fields where Harold Brennan had once discovered the creatures that would change all their lives. What had begun as a simple bug bite on an ordinary Tuesday morning had become a medical revolution that was transforming how humans understood their relationship with the organisms that shared their world, and at the center of it all was a small, farming community that had chosen courage over comfort, truth over secrecy, and service over safety, proving that even the smallest places could make the biggest difference when people were willing to trust each other with their most important secrets.